Hello, everyone. Welcome. Great to see folks joining. I'll give a minute as people continue to come in. As you're joining, I've just opened a poll, so that should have popped up on your screen so that you can let us know who you are. We want to get to know everyone who's in the room today. We are so excited that so many folks have joined us. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm already seeing 100 live attendees, and we've actually reached a big goal today. And we have our most popular event ever with over 900 registrations. And this is our biggest event in over 12 years of existence at DataKind. So we're so thrilled that you are here and part of our community. We've been really working to grow and cultivate this community of social impact professionals who are all using data science and AI in the service of humanity. And so we're glad that you're here and that you're part of that community, and glad to be on this journey to using data science and AI with all of you in the room. And so thanks for everyone who's answering the poll. I'll give a couple more minutes as we get started for folks to indicate who you are in that opening poll. Please know you can pick more than one answer. So if more than one thing applies to you, that's also welcome. So we've been researching and experimenting with generative AI since for over 15 months. And this fabulous team is really excited to share with you what has happened in the last year and some updates on how it applies to social impact organizations. My colleague, Matt Harris, the head of data science at DataKind, he has spent more than half of his time in the last year focused on generative AI research and development. So he's got some great insights to share with all of us. The wonderful Liz Zubiri, who's change management lead for digital transformation at the UN Refugee Agency. She's brilliant, and she's participated in DataKind's recent Learning Circles program in January for generative AI being used equitably and accountably in social impact organizations, and figuring out what the process and strategic plan and use case is for that. And so she's going to be sharing just a real example of that process and what it's like to identify your use case and think about all the constraints and proceed with careful guardrails in place. So I'm excited to hear from her. And I'll also share some key takeaways from the research, planning, and execution of those learning circles and what has come across in many different social impact organizations as part of our community, as we've got lots and lots of professionals working on generative AI in partnership with DataKind. If you're not familiar with DataKind, we are a nonprofit that helps mission-driven organizations unlock their data science potential responsibly, focused on equity and accountability. And so we harness the power of data science and AI in the service of humanity by teaming talented data and AI experts with social actors to collaboratively design and innovate to tough social challenges. And this webinar is part of our nonprofit Data 101 webinar program. It's meant to build data science and AI capacity in the sector. We provide these webinars on various topics, and the follow-up is an option to participate in a free 30-minute one-on-one consultation with DataKind, which we really hope you'll join us for a consultation to continue to engage as part of our DataKind community. And I'm excited to share that our next webinar in the series is already planned to expand on this one due to the interest that we saw in this one. We'll have 3 more social impact organization professionals speaking on their approach for using generative AI, just like Liz is going to be doing today. And we hope to see you at one of the next ones as well, as we continue to grow our capacity together. So with that, I'm going to end our closing poll. Thanks to everyone who responded. It looks like many of you are new to data science. The majority of you are social impact professionals. We've got a couple of volunteers here. And most of you are new to DataKind, not a lot of previous partners. So wonderful to have you in the room. For those new, welcome, whether you have data science experience or not. I'll share the results so everyone can take a look at that. And with that, our learning objectives for today are great for whatever category you're in, but glad to see so many new to data science, because we will learn the basics of generative AI and how the technology has evolved in the last year. This is a follow-up to a webinar that happened a year ago. So we'll send the link to that if you want to watch that as well, if you haven't seen it yet. We'll talk about how to examine equity and accountability and begin to build that into your process and evaluation as well. As I mentioned already, you'll hear examples of social impact organizations using and how that generative AI is being applied. We'll hopefully give you the opportunity to ideate and inspire some thoughts around how you might want to use generative AI at your organization. And we'll definitely have resources that will help you get started to take your next steps that we'll be providing. Make sure you're checking out the chat as we go, because lots of resources will be shared in the chat throughout this entire webinar. And finally, we hope you'll be ready to talk about your specific situation in office hours with DataKind. And how are we doing that? We'll start with a quick refresher from Matt of what happened in the next year. Then we'll go into those practical use cases, the specific example from UNHCR with Liz. And then we'll go with step-by-step how to get started resources before going into Q&A. We will have lots of time for Q&A, so please share your questions as we go. You don't need to wait until the end, but please use the Q&A feature in Zoom instead of the chat. So if you go to the menu at the bottom, there's something that says Q&A. Please click on that and submit your question using that. And with that, I'll let Matt take it away.
Thanks so much, Rachel. It's wonderful to see everyone here today. Goodness, loads of people. So what is generative AI? You know, I'm sure by now over the last year or so, many of you have had some experience of working with ChatGPT, but we just wanted to just put that baseline back in again, that generative AI is a subset of AI, artificial intelligence, that involves algorithms or uses algorithms to generate new content. So you've probably seen image generation, text generation with tools like ChatGPT, and what's coming next in the roadmap is music and other mediums like video and so forth. So, and a key component to this is it typically or often is content that looks very much or very similar to content that a human would produce. So what's happened in the last year? Now, this is just a sample. I couldn't squeeze it all into a slide. The world has been on fire, as I'm sure you may have realized already. This time last year, we were just on the cusp of a lot of new models and new platforms and new products all coming out. And in the last year, that has accelerated essentially. So we've seen a dizzyingly rapid advance in the model. So at this point last year, I think we were on GPT 3.5. Since then, we've had 3.5 Turbo, GPT-4. We've got DALL-E 2 now. OpenAI are continually evolving and producing new models, but it's not just, they are not the only player in the game. We are seeing open source models coming to bear, and that's a really exciting development. So platforms such as Hugging Face are doing an amazing job with Hugging Chat and a whole array of new models that are open to people, as well as Meta opening up Llama 2 as an open model for people to use. We're beginning to see some movement on regulation. So as you can see here, key parts of that, the EU AI Act is now a thing. We've seen some really wonderful strategy and policy documents coming from UNOCHA, Generative AI for Humanitarians. And in countries like the US, administrations are beginning to make some steps towards putting some kind of regulation in place around AI. I think it's still very formative, and much of that regulation may not yet have teeth, but at least things are beginning to go in the right direction. So what an amazing year we've had. So something that everyone is really, really accelerating towards right now. We've had all the really very impressive kind of demos, and I'm sure many of you have played with ChatGPT and it's like, whoa, or other generative AI tools. They can be magical at times and produce very plausible and very amazing and imaginative content. But in the real world, we have to turn those tools into something that we can safely put in front of people so that we actually help them with day-to-day work and tasks. This stuff has to be useful. And with that comes a whole list of requirements of turning something, operationalizing LLMs and other generative AI solutions into something that is economical, that is safe, and is actually performant and actually does what is better than the classical or traditional techniques. So that falls into decisions around architecture. We've seen in the last year, or rather recently, um, uh, uh, a development of using agents, which are multiple instances of using large language models. So when you ask them a question, they can actually work together and solve that task. We're seeing code execution. So ChatGPT, for example, has something called code interpreter. So when you ask a question, it can generate the code to find the answer for you. I mean, this is amazing. Even a year and a half ago, that probably wouldn't have been even a practical, couldn't be considered a practical option, but it is now. So in designing these solutions and operationalizing, there's a decision point about architectures such as this. What's interesting about that is because the field is moving so rapidly, it makes it quite difficult to resolve on a solution that's going to have longevity, is actually going to be something that's still going to be useful 1 year from now, because many vendors and open source providers or open model providers are releasing new features all the time. So there's no point investing in something which in 6 months is going to be very free or very low cost. But with all of that operationalization comes risk and concern. So many of you are probably aware that there are some concerns around bias, transparency. Vendors such as OpenAI do not make their models open for they maintain it's for safety issues. But of course, we have the proprietary aspect of any commercial company. Hallucination, by now, you may have heard of. That's where ChatGPT gives you an answer from its training data, and it seems very plausible, but it's absolutely wrong. And because of that plausibility of looking like human-generated content, us as humans, it makes it a little bit more dangerous because we don't feel that this is coming from a computer at times. We have deep fakes. We have threats to democracy around that, with misinformation, disinformation rather, environmental aspects, and copyright and intellectual property. So some of these concerns, they're still around. They are very, very important and things that need to be tackled and addressed. On to the next. But it's worth noting that as organizations have been developing and exploring this operationalization of generative AI solutions, there is a continuum of risk. And so what we've seen in the last year is many organizations are focusing on the lower risk applications of generative AI. So, for example, grounding is a really, really prevalent, really common thing at the moment, whereby you have a chatbot that only gives you answers from the data that you provided, not from its training data, which came from the internet and a whole range of different sources, but only the data you've provided, and you can ground the responses. So those kind of applications are somewhat safer than the other end of the spectrum, where we just dive in and ask ChatGPT I'm in an emergency situation, how do I help this patient? And that's really dangerous because it can hallucinate and give you incorrect advice. So it's just worth noting there's a continuum of risk. We are seeing, as I mentioned earlier, various policy and regulation initiatives in play, and that's really, really great and exciting to see. One example here is Generative AI for Humanitarians, produced by UN OCHA. This is a wonderful document. I recommend anybody to actually read that document. It's written beautifully. It's really easy to digest and understand. One concept that they present in there is 10 rules of thumb for organizations using generative AI. One would hope many of these are fairly practical and easy to understand. So don't use GenAI unless it's actually going to add value over those traditional techniques. Standardization: if you're working for an organization, use generative AI within the tools that are officially approved in that organization, because they will come from vendors and producers of generative AI, which have privacy documents and privacy protocols that can be reviewed in detail to make sure they align with an organization's goals. account setup. So, you know, be careful about the data you share in public generative AI services. Prompt engineering is something that you've probably heard of by now. Just make sure that prompt engineering is evolved systematically rather than just experimenting on the fly. So there are a variety of tools now that you can use to backtest your solutions to make sure that what they're doing is actually what you want. Confidentiality. So depending on the service that you use, each of which will have a different set of rules about what they do with your data. Many now have by default, do not use your prompts in further training of models, but you need to be really careful of that, and you need to make sure that what you're putting into the system is not going to be used further down the line by and shared with third parties. Generation of content and synthetic media. So we are seeing a real strong use case, for example, in generating social media posts. Anything that is done by generative AI should definitely have a human in the loop reviewing that content. Bias avoidance. So this is something that is prevalent and within any kind of machine learning or AI context, but it is especially important in the generative AI world, where models are trained on information that's garnered from the internet and various sources, which unfortunately can contain the various biases that exist in human communication. Transparency, always be clear that you're using it, and fact checking. Don't just assume that your tool is giving you the right answer. You need to build frameworks around it to validate and ensure that it is doing the right thing and it is factually correct. So just a quick example of putting all that together. At DataKind, we've been working with Save the Children and Microsoft and a consortium of humanitarian response organizations on seeing what opportunities exist within data for using generative AI to improve response times, reduce the amount of effort, and so forth. And so we've been interviewing lots of people, user research as well as literature research, and we've identified a few key areas. Conversational data analysis is one area where people are telling us there's so much data, we don't know how to garner or extract actionable insights from that data. It's really challenging it's just daunting. There's just too much of it. This is where large language models can be brought to bear to help with that. So one of those, sorry, next slide. And so this is just an example of the one particular project that DataKind are working on. So if you remember a few slides back, we mentioned about operationalization. Cost has to be quite low. And one thing that we've established is if you're using GPT-4, it can be quite slow. And if you have thousands of users, it can be quite expensive. So we need to optimize for that. Similarly, what it does, we need full transparency. If it's answering a question about data, we need to be able to see what code it's running, and we need to be able to certify whether the answers are actually correct. So it's key that we have a human in the loop, low cost. And so one design pattern that we've come up with is to extend what's called LATM, which is large language models as tool makers, where they generate their own skills, but to extend that with a strong human in the loop part within the workflow, as well as bringing into play the concept of keeping data up to date for those skills. So it's just an example of where we're trying to operationalize and optimize all of those things that we talked about earlier. Thanks.
Thanks, Matt. So that's one example of what DataKind's been working on with Save the Children and what has happened in the last year. But how are other and more social sector organizations beginning to think about and use generative AI? So our answer here comes from DataKind's research, collaborative projects, the Learning Circles program mentioned earlier, where we did peer-to-peer knowledge sharing with a cohort and data strategy support with trusted experts. So first, we found that careful thought about and solving for safety, accountability, and equity, which Matt already talked a lot about, but equity and accountability in generative AI is already top of mind for social impact organizations. Many of you are feeling that initial excitement of generative AI, but also very wary about ethical concerns, and we don't need to explain to you why to care about things. This crowd knows and is already focused on values. So we're really focused here on capturing a full picture of all the areas guardrails are needed and what those guardrails are and what we can do to actually implement them, as Matt shared. Generative AI is easy for anyone to just use, but a limiting factor in ensuring safety by design is making sure you have the technical skills and guardrails to set up those guardrails and the substantial time and effort it takes for responsible implementation, as Matt mentioned. So common concerns include bias, accuracy, inclusivity, security, accessibility, protecting IP, and there are solutions to address these, but one key thing that can help is really narrowing down your use case to a very clearly defined starting point to protect against your risks and do generative AI in alignment with your values. My colleague is going to share a few resources in the chat to give you a sense of some of the methods and technological solutions that can enhance safety and minimize risks. So these are things like red teaming or content filtering, evaluation methods, RAG, hide, network graphs. Some of these you've maybe heard of, some of these you haven't at all. Maybe you've never heard of any of them. It's beyond the scope of our 1 hour today. But the point is that I want to give you a little sense of that literature that exists so that you know how important it is to dive into the literature more deeply if you are considering implementing and building your own generative AI solution. So with that important thing off the bat, let's talk about those use cases that are really generating the most enthusiasm across the social sector. In engaging with our community, we found 4 key areas that most are excited about. The first is personalized service delivery. A common example is in education or training content, really identifying the right modules or materials to provide to the end user based on their previous experience. And this applies to many different types of social impact organizations, from supporting local campaigners with personalized, localized information from data analysis to job matching or interview prep. And this is really exciting, but it's also the most risky. And when social impact organizations evaluate using generative AI in this way, a lot of times they end up deciding that this one is not worth doing for now. The guardrails and risks and technical skills and data literacy in place really mean that we'll have to build up to use cases like this. But a nice starting point is data management, analysis, and data science. So this can really supplement and speed up a lot of technical work. Data and coding skills are still required by the end user to check everything, but generative AI can provide assistance with data cleaning, database wrangling, quality checks, data analysis, qualitative text analysis is hugely helpful, like summarizing research. Metadata prediction is something DataKind's doing a lot of, like labeling data, creating code books, and all of that. And then third, you'll hear a little bit from Liz on this one, is knowledge management and access. So navigating many resources to find and summarize the most relevant information. I think this is a hugely common challenge and amazing opportunity because there's just so much information where staff or users are overwhelmed and can't find what they need, and GenAI can really speed up the process there. And this can overlap with accessing data, like Matt just shared, where you can look at accessing knowledge that comes out of data sets. And then finally, content creation, the one that most folks are aware of, generating images, communication materials, job descriptions, presentations, curriculum, anything like that. So I want to give 3 quick examples of how our sector is leveraging existing generative AI tools with simple prompts for ChatGPT or other resources. And this comes from a blog that will go in the chat that's on ICT Works. It's a really fabulous resource. So I think this is really accessible starting point. So one example is Dolly to visualize an inclusive forest city. An aid agency in Indonesia is using this. And here's the prompt given for you right here to get an aspirational image of a future capital city to really inspire and support their fundraising efforts. And then using ChatGPT to resolve a website issue, a really practical thing that a social enterprise in Indonesia was doing is utilizing ChatGPT with these exact prompts to resolve their website glitch without the assistance of an experienced website developer, because it's a small organization, small team that didn't have that capacity. So they got those step-by-step instructions and were able to resolve their problem without the IT engineer. And then third, you can see the prompts here. This is a series of 4 prompts that were used alongside our studio to generate some scatter plots and visualize data for decision making without going too deep into the needs of the data. And so that's a really great way to combine the use of generative AI with additional data skills and supplement data science work to really speed up what you're doing if you're in the data science space. And then finally, we're also developing our own tools. So first, there's Moms First is rolling out a paid leave.ai, a tool to help New York parents access their paid leave benefits. So lots of folks in the nonprofit space have developed specific use cases and tools that are helping their people that they're working with. Another example is Nonprofit AMA, which is an AI tool with curated content for nonprofits. You can ask anything about nonprofits, marketing, consulting, etc. Uliza Llama is an open access large language model fine-tuned for Swahili. It's open for public access and it was developed by Jacaranda Health. So if you're working anywhere where Swahili is spoken, you know that large language models have not done as good of a job with many languages around the world. And so this is one example of increasing language accessibility by fine-tuning with a specific language in mind. Launchpath is a neat tool that provides a gamified experience that guides nonprofit professionals through every step of the innovation process and really helps you along the way if you're looking to expand your innovation programs at your nonprofit. Higher Bar AI. This organization has done a fabulous job with thinking about survey evaluation, and they have an open toolkit for AI-powered survey instrument evaluation on GitHub, and it reviews surveys and provides important recommendations with rationales for that recommendations. You can see in the screenshot here, there's a phrasing and translation issue that the tool found and is pointing out in the comments of the document. Rising Academics is addressing the maths education crisis in sub-Saharan Africa using a tool called Rory, which is a chat-based virtual maths tutor integrated into WhatsApp that operates on affordable mobile phones in areas with limited connectivity to support math education. And the last tool I'll share is going back to the one that Matt mentioned. DataKind is working with Save the Children to develop a tool that can be configured to access a range of humanitarian data sources and analysis through conversation. And we're excited about the many applications and data sets that we can bring this into. And this diagram shows a prototype with a few data set examples, Relief Web and HDX, and many of the lessons learned that Matt shared earlier really come into play in this example. And we really are focused on grounding the solution in user questions and working closely with our community to build a solution with careful guardrails in place. So hopefully you've got lots of ideas and inspiration for tools you could use or tools you could do something similar to. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Liz to share more about what they're up to.
Thanks a lot, Rachel. Happy to share what's been going on in our side of the sea. So, as everyone else, we're in the same boat with everyone else in the social sector. So, at UNHCR, we are just trying to also keep up with all the changes in the tech space. In fact, in 2023, it's a big year for us. We launched 7 new systems to change the way we work. This transformation was, well needed, and it's really a long time coming. But it was still challenging because we had, limited time, limited resources, and of course, like all of us, limited funding. So imagine in normal settings, for example, if you want to deploy Salesforce or Workday, that alone, a system alone, could actually take you 5 to 6 years to deploy across the HQ and field operations, especially taking into account if you have countries with low internet access and other barriers. However, in our case, we had to roll out 7 in just 2 years. So it's definitely a big bang approach, and that's really a big ask for change management. And that is why we turned to actually try to leverage on crowdsourcing and community building, because it's a big problem and we need all the hands that we could get to help each other. We want to move away from individual ticket resolution to actually collective incident management. So we established 3 layers of initial support. First, we have the training hub for independent learning resources. Next, you have a weekly walk-in session to ask your questions that happens twice a week. And if you have any questions that are outside the office hours, you could actually have or post your question on a dedicated Teams channel and someone will answer for you. But still, even with all those efforts that actually require a lot of work, sometimes even 24/7 efforts from our team, the tickets just keep on coming. So right now we average on around 1,500 tickets per month. And just note that how many of us are there in the small team? We have a small team of 10 supporting 800 staff globally. So you could see that the ratio is for every, let's say, one support staff, we support 80 supply colleagues. And that's really a lot. Because that's not the only thing we do. We actually maintain knowledge assets, test for quarterly releases and updates, and actually coordinate also with the process owners. We also struggle a lot with balancing tickets, especially for Asia and Americas, because the small team is based in Budapest, so there's a lot of time zone. So if anyone from America cries at, let's say, 10 a.m. or 11 a.m., we're very sorry, but right now there's no one to answer their tickets. And at the same time, there's a lot of, let's say, different languages that our colleagues are using. And like we agree that of course the incident or the individual incident ticket resolution is still needed, especially for the most complex cases. 60% of what we actually receive are about, let's say, well documented bugs and well communicated issues. Like we have already sent a lot of email blasts, like a lot of tips, a lot of messages in the channel. But I think they all got lost in the sea of links, notifications, and documents, which I cannot fault them because we have to agree here, as Matt was saying, like everything is just on fire, everything is just everywhere all at once. So it's really hard to keep up. So just imagine, like the dream is that instead of replying, let's say, to the same simple questions, 4 or 5 times a day, we have an internal chatbot to actually help our colleagues answer their questions regardless of the time zone, regardless of the language, and point them to the right resources whenever they need it. But this is just one. What I sent or what we've shared to you is just a very, let's say, idea that is just on the conceptualization page. We also have a lot of 21 chatbots actually in the pipeline for both internal and external audiences. They're all in different stages. Some are in conceptualization, just like the supply chatbot, while others are actually in implementation. So if you go to the links that China would probably tell you later, you could see some resources and actually reports on how we're doing. First, for example, our protection unit is actually developing a virtual assistant to summarize refugee laws and use this to support policy dialogues with governments and stakeholders. So imagine you don't have to run or do the case digest, run through 500 pages on your own. You have a companion to do that with you. And as there's someone on the loop, like there's a human in the loop, and you could actually double check before you go ahead and present it to the public audience. In Brazil, they also released an external chatbot to combat disinformation among refugees from Venezuela. So the chatbot also sends audios and videos to make it accessible. So also returning back from Matt's discussion of low risk, high risk, you would see that a lot of our efforts are actually concentrated on the low to medium risk because we understand that while AI is actually a very good tool that could have a lot of positive use cases for efficiency, simplification, there's also a lot of risks and let's say challenges in sustaining and maintaining that. So in general, UNHCR, like all other UN agencies and nonprofits, we're optimistically exploring with our principles in mind. So we have 6 guiding principles that you can find on our digital transformation strategy, but let me highlight 3, which is accountability to affected people, protection rights, and digital efficiency. So first, we need to talk about accountability to affected people. So a lot of people are talking about, sure, we need to make sure that the community, the people we serve, are actually participating, they are included when we ask for feedback. But how about we actually take a backseat and let the community lead the initiative? In UNHCR, we have a number of refugee-led initiatives, and you can read about them on our Innovation Fund. So there's a lot of resources dedicated only and solely for projects that are maintained and created by the communities that we serve. Next, protection is all about implementing the do not harm principle. So as Matt and Rachel was saying, what are the guardrails that you use? For example, the human in the loop, especially for the high risk projects. And lastly, and I think with all these buzz around AI, we also have to keep our feet grounded and still talk about digital efficiency. We do not need to start from scratch. Like, there are a lot of existing resources and solutions and systems that we could actually build on and improve upon. And it's actually better because we need to maximize the interoperability between systems. So it's highly likely that the tools that you use are already using AI. And it's also part of our strategy in UNHCR that before we explore new solutions, we take a look at our current investments right now in the systems. And when we go back to the first slide I sent you, like Workday, Oracle Fusion, a lot of them are also incorporating AI. So we need to leverage on those. So remember, we don't have to start from scratch to create the equitable and accessible digital future of the people we serve. So it's not a competition, but a chance for collaboration. And with that, I hand it over to Rachel to discuss on how we can further collaborate.
Oh, that was so inspiring, Liz. Thank you. So you might be wondering, how do I do what Liz is doing and get started on our journey? So we've identified 4 key steps to get started at social impact organizations. This will be part of a social sector playbook for generative AI that's in development to be shared openly in the coming months. But first, we want to assess the status quo of knowing what is happening with generative AI at your organizations to establish those clear guidelines and learning paths. This helps to get a clear picture of the level of knowledge in an organization, the tools that are currently in use, and what's relevant. So a simple assessment using a survey with questions like, what are you working with? What potential use cases do you see? What are your current concerns? And what tools and technologies of our interest? And find out what's going on across the organization and any blockers already in place. From this assessment, you can derive, excuse me, the learning materials and trainings. Different organizations or groups within your organization might require different types of trainings, whether it's an introductory material at an all-staff meeting or a prompting workshop or really LLM hosting or fine-tuning RAG systems, different types of technical training and materials. Which brings us to step 2, where we turn those learnings and our organizational values as social impact organizations into policy to define the guidelines based on those assessment of potential ethical and legal risks. So this will enable you to formulate your organization's value-aligned, responsible AI principles and legal guidelines for using generative AI, so everyone at the organization can be on the same page with a standard foundation of an operating procedure or policy that really reflects your values. And this is your opportunity to identify those clear guardrails for your organization in alignment with your values and establish those dedicated artifacts so that you can enable exchange on generative AI, whether it's an Ask Me Anything or an opportunity for AI debunking or just use case scenario discussion, whether it's a Slack channel or an internal newsletter, different opportunities to turn your policy into a conversation and engagement so that everyone is aware and on the same page, depending on the size of your organization. And then step 3, this is the big one. Once you have the foundation in place, is evaluating the opportunities to identify and prioritize relevant use cases and define that vision to focus on for your future. This is a good space to bring in design thinking principles and identify what those most urgent problems are and where GenAI can create the most value. DataKind's playbook has some tips and best practices for discovering projects and identifying opportunity and then designing projects accordingly. You can assess the risks for each opportunity to really narrow that scope. Lots of resources on risk assessment in the playbook as well, and think about sustainability. Once you've considered the challenges, constraints, and guardrails for risk mitigation for all the use cases, that can help you prioritize and narrow down the use case that would be best to get started with. We talked earlier about how a really narrow use case is important to get started. So this is where you go from broad to narrow. And then finally, setting up the tools and tech stack to give proper access to everyone. Often the first step is just using tools developed by others, maybe integrating them into your existing system, whether that's ChatGPT or Copilot or Bard. Try to set up a basic chat completion endpoint in code and try different prompts if you do want to experiment with your own tool. You can use paid subscriptions to see how OpenAI, for example, using ChatGPT's paid subscription, does in answering questions with a PDF as a knowledge base instead of just using the publicly available one as maybe a first step into tools. And really focus on that intuitive grasp of generative AI capacities before diving into a proof of concept, because there's so much to learn in that if your end goal is to build your own proof of concept. Then eventually you would develop and integrate into your own tools if your organization has the capacity for that. So since I just told you to use other tools instead of starting from scratch, what software might you already be using that has generative AI in it? What tools can you use? So Zoom, where we are right now, has generative AI built in. You might be a Salesforce user. There's lots there. Google's whole suite of system has Bard built in with new Gen AI use cases. Microsoft Bing is a search engine that really pulls in generative AI tools. You might be familiar with GitHub Copilot if you're a coder and like to have some of that done for you. Social media platforms use all different types of generative AI. And then just alphabetically, we've got Adobe Firefly, Airtable, Amazon, Asana, and probably most of the tech tools that you use. Just check in with folks at the platform that you're using, or just read up on their documentation and find out what's going on with generative AI at all of these tech platforms. And that brings us to a few favorite resources on generative AI from DataKind's community. This is the last thing before we go into questions. So if you have a question in your head you haven't written down, now's a good time to open the Q&A box, not the chat, and put your question in there. But first, we've got the webinar mentioned earlier where we align on the basics of generative AI history, use cases, risks, and feel free to go back to that one if you haven't seen it yet. Algorithmic Justice League is a really fabulous trailblazing organization that leads the responsible AI space. And if you're looking for a good definition of why we use terms like equitable and accountable when we talk about this, this is really a good place for that. It's a really quick resource. And then Matt mentioned earlier the report on generative AI for humanitarians. This is actually really applicable beyond just the humanitarian space, as you saw with Matt. So we highly recommend it, and that will be put in the chat now. It also shares about guardrails and concepts that are useful across the sector, from the rules of thumb Matt mentioned to different acceptable use cases. And then this next report from the WEF Data Equity's foundational concepts for generative AI, it really has some scaffolding for evaluating your use cases with a data equity lens and provides several frameworks that can be useful for evaluating the use case that most resonates with you. So a good next step after the humanitarian report mentioned to get those concepts for incorporating your safety plan or policy. And then what's DataKind doing? If you want to learn more in depth on the technical content of some of our generative AI research, the blog that Matt runs, sharing the link there, will give some practical examples and insight on how to implement best practices and lessons learned into your own work. This TED Talk with the co-founder of LangChain does a really good job of connecting the technical elements of a language model to use cases, summarizing some of those important concepts that might be like a level 2 if you're ready for that, like RAG and fine tuning and chains and agents, some of the stuff that Matt went into. If you were a little bit confused but excited for more on that, this is a good spot to go next. And then as you're starting to think about policies for implementation, this matrix for selecting a responsible AI framework is really helpful in evaluating your use case. And then again, just mentioning the playbook has some design thinking guidelines. And soon we'll have public resources, but I'm also excited to share the link to our next webinar so you can hear about what other orgs are doing in the space. And with that, we'll go into the Q&A, seeing lots of great questions in here. And we'll start with one, maybe Matt can kick us off, and Liz, if you have thoughts you can add too. How are you describing the specific cybersecurity issues with generative AI? Someone was at an event yesterday and had their concerns dismissed. So what language can she use to go back to them and really demonstrate how important cybersecurity is in GenAI?
First of all, we're not going to dismiss you. That's a terrible thing they got dismissed. My goodness. It's a very serious concern, depending on the application. So, for example, I think in one of my operationalization, which is a hard word, slides that I mentioned earlier, one consideration is something called prompt injection, where somebody can subvert your conversational agent to execute or do some tasks that it wasn't intended for, which is within the realm of cybersecurity. And so you can implement frameworks and testing around that. And in fact, what we are doing with our solutions within DataKind is using content safety service within Azure that actually will aim to detect those kind of attacks and mitigate and prevent them from doing what the nasty person on the other end was trying. Other than that, another aspect to this is if you have a conversational agent generating code, then that, of course, is a huge cybersecurity concern. And the way we've tackled that is to delegate that kind of very sensitive code execution to organizations. So within Azure, we are using Code Interpreter, which is a sandboxed environment that helps. It is a lot safer than us running the code ourselves as generated from input from a user. So cybersecurity is definitely a concern about issues, but I think when you've gone back to your question, yeah, I mean, those are the specific concerns that we are working on at the moment: code execution and prompt injection. And the rest of the cybersecurity, which comes along with running any kind of web application, those are still the traditional cybersecurity considerations that we are taking into account.
Liz, have you found anything that works for you in making people prioritize cybersecurity?
I think it hasn't been dismissed also in our organization. In fact, I think there's a lot of pushback to use Gen AI like from the start, because they were very overly cautious from the cybersecurity. I couldn't think of a specific term or a specific framework, but as I put in the chat, maybe what could help is the UN will also release its human rights framework for the protection of rights and digital emerging technologies. So maybe that could help set the tone. Yeah.
Awesome. Hopefully that was helpful and you don't feel dismissed. One question is on how can generative AI help with working on data while keeping data privacy as a look after term? I know we've all got lots of experience with that. Matt, can you go ahead and share what at a high level?
So building, I mean, a lot of organizations are putting in regulations and policies so that people working at those organizations can use generative AI in a safe way that protects privacy. And a foundation of that, and this is one of the 10 rules of thumb that came out of the UN OCHA report, which is just common sense, is to use providers that are approved by your organization that go through a rigorous review of privacy agreements. So take an example, say Azure, where we are using Azure large language models. We already have an established privacy agreement with Azure because we've historically had things that run in the cloud environment at Azure. And we've reviewed that meticulously with the context of GenAI to ensure that our data is not reused outside of our organization. It's not reused to train models, and our data, that any data submitted to those Azure resources is absolutely ring-fenced and private within our organization. And so that's kind of the approach that many organizations are taking, is to use approved vendors where the privacy agreements in place are rigorous. Now, of course, that might not apply to all organizations. I can see maybe there are organizations that have extremely private medical data that they wouldn't even want in Azure, even though Azure have a very rigorous, and many of the cloud providers actually have a very rigorous privacy pose strategy. So it is possible to run things locally, but there it starts becoming very expensive because large language models cost an awful lot of money to run if they're not in a web environment. So yeah, that's some concepts that we've been taking into account.
Liz, what have you done? Do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, so for UNHCR, we actually really leverage on the, let's say, consultation with our technology partners. So like Matthew has said, we have some dedicated vendors whom advise us on privacy and like what's the best way to store data, how to anonymize it, and how to make sure that it doesn't leak and it's protected from any possible breach. But at the same time, it's also important that it's embedded in all the policies, not only externally but even internally. That you tell explicitly to all your staff that please make sure that everything here is confidential. It's not for you. It's not something that you plug in Chat GPT, because it's an external resource and you don't have to start with a complex policy. For us, we started with just a simple do's and don'ts, and no like 10 pages policy, so just the short bullet points to make it concise and accessible to all. So I think it's a good start. Yeah.
Awesome. This is a question I'm excited about. Would love to see if any, if you have any deeper research on the climate and environmental impacts of generative AI, something we've started to look into, but it seems like a nascent field with very real measurement problems. Same experience, have started to look into it. Very real measurement problems for sure. I did some research and did a lot of asking around, including a conversation with Matt last year on this, and many people have done some nice back of the envelope calculations that they were willing to share with me, and come to the point of really, if you are being mindful of the amount of computing power you're using, it really is minor compared to a lot of other tools. But Matt, if you remember some of the high level summary of the conversation we had in the back of the envelope calculations you did, that might be fun to share.
Yeah, and in fact, so a back of an envelope calculation would seem to yield that the impact is not as severe as we feared. However, it becomes quite complicated in terms of how models are reused, the kind of volume of traffic that they get. I will say that funny enough, we're currently reviewing a paper right now that came out last year, and it's called Climate Change from Large Language Models by Zhu and Tiwari. And there they review the clarity of environmental impact from various LLM providers. So we are investigating, we're looking into it, but we don't yet have that exact clear answer at the moment. What about you, Liz?
Same question. I have the same question as as our participant. It's a very new field. It's very interesting, but please keep me in the loop too. I will very interested to know.
Looking forward to someone in this room solving this problem. How do you calculate the costs of using AI and explain to people with low levels of digital skills? Liz, is this something you've worked on?
Sure. Like I think in upfront or the most common use cases is you actually, let's say, compute the time you reduce. For example, on doing a task, or for example, the time it takes you to, in our case, to close a ticket. And then how much of that time could actually be, let's say, reevaluated or restructured into doing more strategic work that has a more impact on the organization. So a lot of manual things are repetitive, and how much of that could be automated. And of course, you, let's say, so that's one. And then another thing is the, let's say, the cost also of human resources. Unfortunately, there's a lot of, let's say, funding limitations right now, and I think it's all in the, how do you say it, in all the nonprofit sector is there's a lot of layoffs as well. But of course, we do not want to use Gen AI as a, as the reason why we're cutting or actually cutting or laying off people. What we want is to actually use Gen AI to actually optimize the work that they do and to help them reach the goal or the objectives that they need. Yeah, yeah,
Matt, do you have
that's it.
anything to add on that? Yeah.
Would, and of course, a train is going by right as I'm about to answer. The only thing I would add, it's quite interesting. I've noticed a few people have asked very similar questions around costs, and it isn't an easy thing to establish. I really like Liz's spot on about there are benefits and there are cost savings with implementing these solutions. There are costs associated with the resourcing to build and maintain them. Technical costs can vary a little bit, and it depends on the solution that that you're trying to pursue. So there's a sort of there's a range. So one, for example, can use large language models and all the power that they bring to bear, for example, in OpenAI GPTs, if the privacy policy of OpenAI is acceptable to an organization and the data is is publicly available data, for example. And that offers a relatively low cost way to bring to bear large language models without writing any code, and all of the hosting and maintenance is taken care for you. But there's a cost for the people that use it of $20 per month for ChatGPT Plus. I just raise that as one example because at the other end, you could host everything yourself, develop everything yourself, and there's a whole ton of different costs there. And it's really up to the organization to decide where on that journey or where on that scale makes most sense. If it's a small organization with no technical people at the organization, and it might make sense to use a no-code solution like OpenAI GPTs. But if there's, more technical people, then possibly something on the other end of the scale. And therefore, the costing depends on that decision. So it's quite difficult to give a kind of blanket cost analysis. But I'd love, Rachel, maybe in a future webinar, we can present and do some analysis of those various options and the costs associated with them.
Yeah, it sounds like we might have to have more than one follow-up webinar on this. Sounds good. Well, the rest of the answers we'll just have to save for one of those follow-up webinars or for office hours because we're coming up at time. So I've got a quick poll that I'd love you to answer so we can learn how we did here and if you've learned anything. And while you're completing that, I'm excited to share that we do want to offer everyone here today access to office hours. The link is in the chat, and this is just a 30-minute consultation with DataKind to discuss your challenges, questions. If you have a question, please, please, please include the question in your sign up so we can make sure we're prepared to answer it or get the right people on board to answer it. And so this is really your space to connect with us and join our DataKind community. So excited to have you all in office hours. And I want to share there's many more webinars always available on our YouTube playlist, which the link is in the chat as well. Our next webinar on generative AI in action, we've got 3 wonderful social impact organizations that will be sharing examples on April 24th of what they're doing, how their process went in what they were getting kicked off the ground, and where they are, and those real practical examples will be in place. And then we'll have to have a future one with some cost evaluation and the different options for getting started. Finally, there's a survey that we'll share in the chat as well as in the follow-up email that will really help us inform future offerings. If there's a topic that you would like us to talk about in one of these webinars, you just put it in that survey, and we always look at it for new topic ideas. Last but not least, if you're not subscribed to our newsletter, please do that. And we want to just share a big thank you to the speakers today and our whole community of many brilliant social impact professionals and volunteers who contributed to the content and helped us answer some of these questions and learned with us as part of our community in the last year. So looking forward to another year of learning with all of you in community, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.